A man was found hanging from a bridge in London. It was early morning, June 18th, 1982. A postal clerk on his way to work saw the body. It was dangling from scaffolding under Blackfriars Bridge. The man was well dressed. He wore an expensive suit. His pockets were stuffed with things. There were bricks. And about $15,000 in different currency. The man was Roberto Calvi. At first, the police thought it was suicide. It was a strange scene, but suicide was the simplest answer. The story hit the news. And for those who knew Calvi, suicide didn't make sense. Calvi was known by a nickname. They called him God's Banker. He was the chairman of one of Italy's largest private banks, Banco Ambrosiano, and his most important client was the Vatican. The question wasn't just how he died. The real question was why. Why was the head of a powerful Italian bank hanging under a London bridge, his pockets filled with rocks? The answer pulls you into a world of secret societies, mafia bosses, and Vatican priests. It's a story about money, power, and secrets, and what happens when the man who holds all the secrets becomes a problem. To understand why Roberto Calvi died, you have to understand who he was and the world he built. He wasn't born into wealth. He came from a simple background in Milan. He was smart and very ambitious. He started working at Banco Ambrosiano as a clerk. He worked his way up. He was good with numbers. He was even better with people. He knew how to gain trust. He knew how to be useful. Banco Ambrosiano was not just any bank. It was a Catholic bank. It had deep ties to the Vatican. It was seen as a respectable conservative institution. Calvi wanted to change that. He saw a bigger future for the bank. He wanted it to be an international power. When he became chairman in the 1970s, he started to make his move, and to do that, he needed powerful partners. His first important partner was the Vatican itself, specifically the Vatican Bank. Its official name is the Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR. The man who ran the IOR was an American archbishop named Paul Marcinkus. Marcinkus was a big, imposing figure. He was from Cicero, Illinois, Al Capone's old neighborhood. He was tough. He was not a typical priest. He was the Vatican's money man. The Vatican Bank is unique. It's not like a normal bank. It operates under Vatican law, not Italian law. This gives it incredible secrecy and freedom. Marcinkus wanted to make the Vatican's money grow. He needed a way to invest and move money around the world without a lot of questions. Italian laws were strict. The Vatican Bank was a sovereign entity. It could do things other banks couldn't. Calvi and Marcinkus found each other. They were a perfect match. Calvi had the bank, Banco Ambrosiano. Marcinkus had the Vatican's protection and its name. Together, they could build a financial empire that operated in the shadows. Calvi started setting up shell companies, dozens of them. They were based in places like Panama, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas. Places with loose banking laws. These companies had no real employees. They had no real offices. They were just names on paper. But they could buy and sell things, and they could borrow money. This is where the scheme started. Calvi used Banco Ambrosiano to lend huge sums of money to these shell companies. We're talking about hundreds of millions, and eventually over $1 billion. But who was backing these loans? The Vatican Bank. Marcinkus provided something called letters of comfort. These letters were not legal guarantees. They were vague. They just said the IOR was aware of the companies and their dealings. But for other banks and regulators, a letter with the Vatican's name on it was enough. It looked legitimate. It looked safe. So Calvi's bank was lending massive amounts of money to his own phantom companies with the Vatican's quiet blessing. Where did all this money go? It went everywhere. Some of it was used to secretly buy shares in other companies, giving Calvi even more power. Some of it was used to manipulate stock prices, and a lot of it was used for darker purposes. This brings us to Calvi's other partners. The first was a man named Licio Gelli. Gelli was the head of a secret Masonic lodge called Propaganda Do, or P2. This wasn't a normal group of Masons. P2 was a shadow government. Its members were some of the most powerful people in Italy. There were politicians, judges, military generals, intelligence chiefs, and important businessmen. Calvi was a member. Gelli was their leader, the Venerable Master. P2's goal was to control Italy from behind the scenes. They were fiercely anti-communist. They wanted to steer the country in a right-wing direction. And to do that, they needed money. A lot of it. They needed to fund political parties. They needed to bribe officials. They needed to control the media. Roberto Calvi's bank was their piggy bank. The money flowing through the shell companies was the lifeblood of P2. Calvi was not just a banker, he was the financier for a secret state within a state. And then there was the third partner, the Mafia. The Mafia, particularly the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, had a business problem. They were making enormous amounts of money from heroin trafficking, but this money was dirty. You can't just walk into a bank with millions of dollars in cash from drug sales. You need to wash it. You need to make it look like it came from a legitimate business. This is called money laundering. Calvi was the perfect laundryman. His network of shell companies and his connection to the untouchable Vatican Bank was a dream come true for the mob. They could give their drug money to Calvi, he would move it through his phantom companies, mixing it with other funds, sending it across the world and back again. When it came out the other side, it was clean. It looked like legitimate investment profit. The Mafia invested heavily in Calvi's empire. A powerful Sicilian Mafia boss, Pippo Callo, known as the Mafia's treasurer, was Calvi's direct contact. So you have this triangle of power. Calvi and his bank were at the center. On one side, you have the Vatican providing secrecy and a holy name. On another, you have the P2 Masonic Lodge, providing political protection and power. And on the third, you have the Mafia providing huge amounts of cash and muscle. For a while, it worked beautifully. Everyone was getting rich. Everyone was getting what they wanted. Calvi was at the top of the world. He was powerful. He was respected. He was God's banker. But a house of cards can't stand forever. The problem was the debt. Banco Ambrosiano was lending out real money. But the shell companies that were borrowing it were not real businesses. They weren't making profits. They couldn't pay the loans back. The entire structure was built on a lie. $1 billion black hole was growing at the heart of the bank. As long as new money kept coming in, Calvi could juggle the numbers, he could keep the lie going. But it was getting harder. The trouble started in the late 1970s. The Bank of Italy, the country's central bank, started getting suspicious. The numbers at Banco Ambrosiano didn't look right. They launched an investigation. Calvi used his P2 connections to block them, to slow them down. He had friends in high places who could make problems disappear. But the investigators were persistent. They knew something was very wrong. In 1981, the first big crack appeared. The police raided one of Licio Gelli's villas. They found a list. It was the P2 membership list. Nearly 1,000 names. When that list was published, Italy exploded in scandal. The secret shadow government was exposed, the government fell, Gelli fled the country. Suddenly, Calvi's political protection was gone. He was exposed. Just a few weeks later, Calvi was arrested. He was charged with illegally exporting currency. He was put in prison. In his cell, he tried to kill himself. He slit his wrists and took an overdose of pills, but he was found and saved. Was it a genuine suicide attempt, or was it a performance, a message to his powerful partners that he was under pressure, that he might talk if they didn't get him out? Whatever it was, it worked. His lawyers got him out of prison pending an appeal. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years, but he was free for the moment. He went back to running the bank, but he was a wounded man. His enemies could smell blood. And his partners were getting nervous. The whole system was starting to shake. The final collapse came in 1982. The Bank of Italy finally cornered him. They uncovered the massive hole in Banco Ambrosiano's books. Over $1.3 billion was missing. It had been loaned to the shell companies and had simply vanished. The bank was insolvent. It was about to fail. Calvi knew the game was over. He knew that when the bank went down, everyone would come for him. The state would want to prosecute him. And his partners, the Mafia and what was left of P2, would want their money back. And they wouldn't ask nicely. He had lost their money. And even worse, he knew all their secrets. He knew who bribed who. He knew how the drug money was laundered. He knew the secrets of the Vatican Bank. He was the one man who could connect all the dots. He had become a liability. The most dangerous liability in Italy. In his final days, Calvi was a desperate man. He tried to blackmail his former partners. He wrote a letter to the Pope threatening to reveal everything the Vatican had done if they didn't help him. He tried to contact Licio Gelli and the Mafia. He was essentially saying, "Bail me out, or I will bring all of you down with me." This was a fatal mistake. You do not threaten men like these. A few days before he died, Calvi shaved his mustache and fled Italy. He used a fake passport. He traveled on a private plane and a boat to Yugoslavia, then to Austria, and finally he flew to London. Why London? It's not entirely clear. Maybe he thought it was a safe place to negotiate. A neutral ground. He checked into a small apartment in Chelsea. He was meeting with other Italians, shady characters who were supposed to be helping him. One was a Sardinian businessman named Flavio Carboni, a man with his own connections to intelligence services and organized crime. On the evening of June 17th, Calvi left his apartment. He was carrying a briefcase. He told his driver to wait. He never came back. The next morning, his body was found under Blackfriars Bridge. So, why was Roberto Calvi hanging from that bridge? The initial ruling of suicide quickly fell apart under scrutiny. His family never believed it. They hired their own investigators. There were too many strange facts. Calvi had a fear of heights. It seemed unlikely he would choose that way to die. The Thames River is tidal. To hang himself from the scaffolding, he would have needed to get there by boat at high tide, in the dark. It would have been an incredibly difficult and awkward act for a 62-year-old man in a suit. Then there were the bricks in his pockets, and the cash. People who kill themselves usually don't weigh themselves down to make sure. The whole scene felt staged. It felt like a message. Years later, the case was reopened in Italy. After exhumations and new forensic reports, the verdict was officially changed. It was not suicide, it was murder. Investigators concluded that he was killed elsewhere and then taken to the bridge and hung there. The symbolism of the location was not lost on anyone. Blackfriars Bridge. In Italian, Frati Neri means Black Friars. P2 members sometimes refer to themselves as the Frati Neri. The choice of the bridge was a chilling signature. The way he was hung also echoed Masonic rituals for punishing a traitor who breaks his oath of secrecy. The message was clear. This is what happens when you betray us. This is what happens when you lose our money and threaten to talk. So who killed him? No one has ever been convicted of his murder. Several major Mafia figures, including Pippo Calò, the Mafia's treasurer, were put on trial in Rome. So was Flavio Carboni, the man Calvi met in London. The prosecution argued that the Mafia had ordered the hit. Calvi had lost a huge amount of their money, and he was threatening to expose their money laundering operations, which reached into the highest levels of Italian finance and politics. They believed Calvi was killed to silence him and to send a message. But the trial ended in acquittals. The court ruled that, while he was murdered, there wasn't enough evidence to prove who exactly did it. The why is much clearer than the who. Roberto Calvi was killed for several reasons, all connected. First, he lost the money. The Mafia, P2, and other powerful investors had poured hundreds of millions into his system. When the bank collapsed, that money was gone. For organized crime, losing that much money is a capital offense. You don't get to declare bankruptcy, you pay with your life. Second, he knew too much. He was the living, breathing ledger of decades of Italian corruption. He knew which politicians P2 had bribed. He knew how the Vatican moved its secret funds. He knew the details of the Mafia's global money laundering network. As long as he was alive and cornered, he was a threat to all of them. Killing him wasn't just revenge, it was risk management. It was plugging a leak that could have sunk everyone. Third, he made that final, desperate threat. By trying to blackmail his partners, he forced their hand. He showed them he was willing to talk. He signed his own death warrant. He gave them no choice but to silence him permanently. The aftermath was a long, slow cleanup. Banco Ambrosiano was liquidated. The Vatican, while denying any legal wrongdoing, eventually paid a goodwill sum of nearly $250 million to the bank's creditors. It was a tacit admission of their involvement. Archbishop Marcinkus was charged by Italian magistrates, but the Vatican claimed diplomatic immunity. He stayed inside the Vatican walls, protected from prosecution. He never faced a court. He was eventually moved out of his job at the bank and died in Arizona in 2006, taking his secrets with him. Licio Gelli was eventually captured and served time in prison, but for other crimes. The death of Roberto Calvi remains one of the great dark mysteries of modern history. We know the story, we know the players, we know the motives, but the final scene, the act itself, is still shrouded in shadow. Who were the men who physically killed him? Who lured him to his death that night in London? We will likely never know for sure, but the reason he was found hanging from that bridge is no mystery. He built a machine fueled by greed and secrecy. He connected the worlds of high finance, espionage, organized crime, and even the church. For years, he was the master of that machine. But in the end, the machine devoured him. And Roberto Calvi died because he was the one man who knew everything. And in the world he chose to live in, knowing everything is the most dangerous thing you can do. His death was a brutal public execution, a final, terrifying message from the shadows.